Hi everyone, here's the Chemist once again, and today I'm reviewing Moby-Dick by Herman Melville, a classic of American literature and a book I had been told horrible things about, that it was a monster of a novel, impossible to crack and fully comprehend, one that crushes even the sturdiest readers, but I don't know why I was so scared of this book. I'm obsessed with sea monsters and I love sea creatures, and one thing this book is, beyond all doubt, is a book about whales. Also, another thing that it's self-evident, and I'm only going to talk about it for 10 seconds because I talk about this stuff all the time and I don't want to sound obsessed, but this book is incredibly Lovecraftian. It's definitely a stepping stone toward Lovecraft's horror. Dagon makes a guest appearance in here. There's reports from a character called Obed Macy, which might or might not be, I believe I maybe once read a paper about that character being an inspiration for Lovecraft's Obed's Marsh in Shadow over Innsmouth. There's a character in here, Pip, one of the most unforgettable characters in the novel, who basically is left behind once he falls out his boat and his boat carries on to hunt a whale, and he is driven mad by the mysterious figures moving at the bottom of the ocean. What's more Lovecraftian than that? Beyond my own petty obsessions though, this is truly a monster of a novel. It's the original great American novel, a sprawling book that tries to contain within itself pretty much all of creation, or at least all of America. This is a book about a very specific topic, and once again it is at times a veritable treatise on cetology, on the study of whales, but at the same time there's a definite Karate Kid thing going on with Moby-Dick, you know, wax and wax, where at one point you go, "Oh, Melville Sensei, I thought you were teaching me about whales, but in fact you were teaching me about everything else in the world." I said it is a monstrous novel, and the usual parallel is that the book Moby-Dick is like the whale Moby-Dick, but I don't think that's the case, because Moby-Dick is one long, white, perfect arrow of death. It's like a train engine turned a sea creature, whereas Moby-Dick, the novel, is more of a Frankenstein monster, zombie, skeleton, lich whale of sorts, made of so many different components and patched together using strong leather and mysterious crystals from the deep oceans. What I mean is that it is a mess. It's not very pretty to look at, and that's one of the key reasons why I believe many people, I myself at times, struggle with the book, which is that it is made of so many conflicting styles. For the first 100 pages or so, it's a rather conventional adventure yarn, very interesting, about this guy Ishmael, who is having kind of a midlife crisis, and so he decides to go hunt for whales, and he meets his friend Queequeg, this man from the South Seas, who is an unforgettable character, and they become good friends. They kind of get married, and I'm not going too much into that topic because it's not my area of expertise, but if you're interested in gender studies, in queer studies, queer theory of literature, this is the holy grail of that stuff. The homoerotic tension in here is unbearable all the time, especially in the first chapters. There's a chapter about squeezing sperm that requires really no commentary. You know, in the Divine Comedy, in The Great Gatsby, in these books, you perceive some homoerotic tension between the characters, but it's nothing like what's in Moby-Dick. Moving beyond that, for the first 100 pages, so it's kind of straightforward. But then as the Pequod goes to sea, the ship starts this voyage to hunt for Moby-Dick. You get to know that old bastard Hayab, and the novel starts to change course completely. It focuses more on characters, it focuses more on reflections about parallels between the life in the middle of the ocean and life in the soul of man, and the inner life of people and of thinkers. In a sense, and this is something that surprised me, and that sounds scary but shouldn't scare you, there is much more plot in the first 100 pages of Moby-Dick than in the following 500. Even though this is kind of a straightforward adventure novel, its plot could be really summarized in a single phrase. And also on the level of style, there is this great commission and melting pot of different literary influences. At times this becomes incredibly Shakespearean. There are some chapters in here that are even written as if, almost as if this were a play. When Hayab speaks, he does speak with that epic blank verse sounding tone of the great Shakespearean villains, Macbeth, Iago. There are a couple of characters in here, most notably Pip, the cook, Stubb absolutely, who could play the role of the Shakespearean fool. They contribute some irony and some laughs to the book. They lighten up the humor a little bit, but also surprisingly in their reveries, even though they sound kind of crazy, at times you find more wisdom and more tragedy than in what you hear from these very serious old birded dude Hayab. And in these characters, in how unforgettable they are, how each of them, Tashtego, Dagu, Queequeg, Stubb, Starbucks, how all of them have their are very well-rounded characters, each with their own personality, each with their idiosyncrasies. Sure, they are larger than life, but at the same time they're relatable, they have understandable thought, even though they express them at times like Lady Macbeth and not like your average sailor. In how human this book is, you find a much needed and a very useful balance to the hefty themes that sometimes go on for chapter upon chapter. They keep the novel anchored to the real world and to the commitments of these people who do a very difficult job and try to make a living out of it, and it prevents the novel from floating into space and turning into a full-fledged treatise on the meaning of life. This should by no means suggest that the parts and the chapters that revolve around the characters and their lives are interesting, whereas the Ishmael's reflections and broodings are all boring. Far from it. In fact, some chapters in here which are nothing but reflections, nothing but parallels between the business of whaling and the business of life, are among the most unforgettable and beautiful pages I've read, possibly in my entire life. There's a chapter in here called Stowing Down and Clearing Up, about how when you hunt for whales, what happens is that you go out to sea, you find a whale, you kill it, which is an extremely gory business, more about that in a second. Then you drag it back to the ship, you have to extract everything of value out of this beast, and the ship turns into a mess, and then you have to clean everything up so that it's shining clean. And once you've done that, immediately you spot another whale and you have to begin anew all over again. And there's a parallel in the chapter between this business and life itself, as in, you know, in life you look for something, and when you find it, it's a messy business, and then you have to clean yourself from it, and then you have to do it all over again. And of course, when I say it like this, it's shit. But when you read about it in Moby-Dick, 400 or 500 pages deep into the novel, it just enlarges your heart and it fills up your insides, and that's of course it's the beauty of literature. But let's not get all soft and misty-eyed here. This is a book about sturdy men, muscular sailors doing terrible business and killing whales with their spears. About whaling as a gory business, I'm not going, of course, to defend or to support all of Melville's views in the book, but make no mistake, this is an incredibly humane book. Even though it revolves around people going after poor whales to slaughter them, it approaches this idea very humanely. You clearly understand how the narrator feels about suffering, about violence, the sorrow that fills him for this business, and how at the same time he is aware that it is his living, that it is his job. There might very well already exist studies like that, but I believe that Moby-Dick is ripe for a post-human reading of it, which focuses on the relationship between the animal, the hunted animal, and the sailor, and shows how they are locked in much more than a relationship between hunter and prey that simply turns around at a certain point, but how in the hunt there's mutual suffering between the two, and I let the graduate students carry on. Probably they've already done it. If you know about interesting studies on Moby-Dick, by all means share them in the comment section. It took me a long time to read this book, a long time for a 600-page novel, because I often had to go over certain passages again. I sometimes had to reread a certain paragraph 2 or 3 times, and part of that had to do with the English. Melville's style is rather convoluted at times, and it gets worse the closer you get to the end, the further you get from Nantucket. And it's not just that it's convoluted and his sentences are full of subordinates. I like that kind of writing. It's more that it's so packed with energy. All of his words are so full of connotations, and sometimes you clearly perceive there's some irony in what he says, but you have to spend some quality time on his paragraphs to understand that. And also, of course, the nautical lexicon is going to be challenging, I believe, even to many native speakers. For that reason, I highly recommend an edition with footnotes, or endnotes like mine. The Penguin Classics edition has some great endnotes and some very interesting and very useful appendixes about nautical terms, about the business of whaling, about the voyage of the Pequod. All of this information about context helps you understand and get more out of the novel. It's kind of vital, especially if, like me, you're not necessarily a native speaker, but also if you're not a 19th century sailor, or if you haven't been on a whaling voyage. I was saying, I had to reread so many of these passages, but the reason why I did, sometimes with this kind of dense novel, let's be honest with each other, yeah, sometimes you don't get a paragraph, but you're like, yeah, who cares? It's the writer's fault. Let's carry on and hope someone dies soon. Whereas with Moby-Dick, I truly wanted to understand all of it, because its reflections are so compelling, and the intellectual games it plays, and the games of references and images it creates, these beautiful world it builds up with its words. I wanted to get all of it, or at least as much of it as I possibly could, through a first reading. It is an addictive book. It is not at all a page-turner, and you should know that from the start. It's a hefty novel, and you'll have to spend a lot of time on it. But if you feel like that, if you feel like a challenge, there's lots of fun to be gotten in here. It's not one of those books that it's hell, and you just have to read it for cultural capital. That's bullshit, by the way. Don't read those books. It makes no sense. No one cares if you've read, I don't know, I don't want to say any title because I'm going to offend some fans. Insert any pretentious big novel at the end of my previous sentence. This is a book you should read for fun, but at the same time know that you're going to break a sweat here and there. I myself, I loved reading it. I do admit that after the Pequod reaches the Pacific and before the final chase for Moby-Dick, that final 100 pages, they were kinda cryptic at times in the reflection and kinda dense, and it was rather hard to pull through. Also, and let me stress this once again, this is a novel about whales and the people who live for whales. The usual thing critics say, especially snobbish critics, is that whales are only an excuse for Melville's reflections on the human nature or for his reflections on 19th century American society. What I personally believe, and this is just a reader's opinion, it's ascientific, it's not supported by any sort of deep study. My personal take is that Melville truly wanted to write a book about whales, and that all the reflections and the brooding is just an excuse to sell this book to intellectuals. There is a passage in here where he says that he doesn't want his book to be taken as a fable or as an allegory, which is clearly ironical, of course, but is it fully? Is it though? What this means, what all of this means, is that, of course, I enjoyed the novel so much because I like whales, I like sea creatures, I like oceans. I've always been interested in that, in the life of the sea. Had this book been about cows or about sheep, I don't think I would have liked the experience so much. So take that into account if you decide to pick up this beast. If this doesn't put you off, get yourself a noted edition and dive into this shark-infested novel full of, I don't know, starfish. I wanted a metaphor for some interesting and cute stuff that's useful, but you don't do shit with starfish. It's full of intellectual tuna. You know, fish that it's nutrient. It's full of energy. Anyway, let me know what you think about Moby-Dick in the comments below. Lots of people, when I mentioned that I was reading the book, if I understand correctly, there's lots of Moby-Dick's fans out there. I also want to hear from people who just couldn't finish the novel, just couldn't pull through, people who didn't like it too much. It happens, especially with classics. Each of us has one or two classic works that didn't really make their heart skip a bit. That's the way I'll put it. In a second, oh, thanks for watching the video, guys. In a second, you'll find links on the screen to others of my reviews or my videos, and I will see you guys in the next video, maybe. And bye, guys.